This is another short video looking at RUAE for Higher English, and this one is focused on imagery. Brief recap about analysis questions in RUAE. The question is either going to specify specific techniques, so you may encounter a question that specifically asks you to talk about imagery. Alternatively, the questions may ask you to comment on any techniques that the writer has used by just asking more generally about their use of language. And if they ask about language, you can talk about anything. That includes sentence structure, repetition, parallel structure, word choice, and of course, imagery. So when we're talking about imagery in RUAE, we're talking about figurative language. If you look online for help about different types of imagery, you'll actually find some misleading and confusing websites that will tell you that it's all about the different senses. So visual imagery, oral imagery, that kind of thing. That's actually not very helpful for analysing in RUAE. We're looking for specific techniques really. Metaphor, simile, personification are the most common techniques. You also get fancier stuff like metonymy, which is things like the crown or the throne representing the position of the kind of royal household, or the White House representing the president, that kind of thing. Or synecdoche, which is similar, but it relates to a part of something representing the whole. So when you're on a ship and you say all hands on deck, you don't just want the hands, you want the people the hands are attached to as well. But those kind of techniques don't come up very often. Generally speaking, we want to focus on metaphors and similes, because 99% of the time, that's what you're going to encounter. Now, I'm assuming if we're sitting higher, we already know the difference between a metaphor and a simile. The metaphor makes that comparison by saying something is something else. The simile uses like or as to make that kind of comparison. It's worth noting, you shouldn't get too worried about mislabeling them. If you call a metaphor a simile or a simile a metaphor, that does not mean that you won't get the marks in RUAE. What is important is what you say about the metaphor or the simile. Now, when you're going through the process of analysing imagery for RUAE, it's important that you do both of these steps. First of all, you have to deconstruct the image, and then you need to explain the effects of the comparison. Okay, now don't worry if you're not sure what that means right now, that's exactly what I'm going to show you. But do remember there's two stages here. You deconstruct the image, you pull it apart, and then you explain the effect of the comparison. So when I talk about deconstructing imagery, this is the process that I mean. You have to be very clear in your head, what is the literal root of the metaphor? That's sometimes called the tenor of the metaphor. What is actually being described? And then what is the figurative image, the vehicle of the metaphor? What is that literal thing being compared to? Okay, if a person is described as being a mountain of a man, then the literal thing is the man, the person, and the figurative image, the vehicle, is the mountain. That's what they're being compared to. And it's important that you're clear with that, because if you get those muddled, your analysis is going to go wrong. So be really, really clear you understand what is literally being described and what is it being compared to. Now, the process I'm going to describe to you here uses Venn diagrams. I'm not sure your level of mathematical ability or whether you're aware of what Venn diagrams are. If you are, you can just fast forward or tune out for 20 seconds while I briefly explain what they are. This is a demonstration of a Venn diagram. You see two overlapping circles. One circle is the number of people who are watching this video. Another circle is the number of people who know what a Venn diagram is, and the area of overlap in the middle is people who are watching this video who also know what a Venn diagram is. Okay, it's a reasonably straightforward concept, but I think if you use this to help you understand metaphors, it will help you get through the process more quickly. Okay, I'm not necessarily suggesting that in the exam you will literally be drawing Venn diagrams to do your analysis, although you can if it helps you, but it's certainly while you're learning the process, if you struggle with imagery, this is a useful thing to do to practice, because it will help you get better at understanding what is the literal root, what is it figuratively being compared to, and the effects of that comparison. And here you can see how you would do that if you were analysing imagery. So one circle is the literal root of the metaphor, the other circle is a figurative image, and in the middle we have the things the two have in common. How are they similar? What traits do they share? That kind of thing. So here's a worked example that we'll go through together just to put this into practice. So first of all, we have a little extract from the text here. Her room was a bomb site. Clothes piled everywhere, discarded cups and plates strewn around, and what were presumably important notes and books half buried in the detritus of teenage life. And the question we're being asked is, how does the writer use imagery to convey the state of her room? So the first thing we need to do is identify where is the metaphor or simile in this extract. And there you can see the metaphor in red. Her room was a bomb site. It's not literally a bomb site. An explosion has not literally happened in that room. That's a metaphor. So that's what we're interested in analysing. So before we go any further, you can stop and have a think about that metaphor. Make sure that you understand why the writer might have used that metaphor and what the significance might be. Indeed, it's a metaphor that you yourself may have used, or your parents may have used to describe your bedroom perhaps. So it should be one that's reasonably straightforward and reasonably familiar to you, but make sure you have a clear sense in your head as to why the writer might have done that before we work through this process. So the first thing we do with our Venn diagram is we put our literal root in the left-hand circle, and our literal root here is her room. That is what's being described, so that's what goes in first. Then in the right-hand side, we have the figurative image. In this case, it's a bomb site. Her room is being compared to a bomb site. So one circle is her room, the other circle is a bomb site. The question is then, what goes in the middle? What goes in her area of overlap? So what we need to think about is, what is there about her room that is like a bomb site? What aspects or features or traits of a bomb site could also apply to her room? And here we have some examples. It's messy, it's in disarray, it's dishevelled, it's disorganised, it's chaotic. There's probably other words you could use. You'll note I'm trying to avoid any kind of generic words like it's not good or it's bad or things like that. Okay, those kind of things are not useful. When we're looking at imagery, the more specific we can be in our words that go in the middle, the better, the more analytical we're being. So here's our worked example written up as an answer. Her room is a bomb site. Question, how does the writer use imagery to convey the state of her room? The answer, the writer compares her room to a bomb site. This metaphor suggests her room is messy, disorganised and chaotic, with her belongings all in disarray. Nothing is where it's supposed to be. Now, it's really important to note, you don't get marks for just identifying the deconstruction of the metaphor. So that first sentence, the writer compares her room to a bomb site. You don't necessarily get any marks for that, but I think it's a really important part of the process for you to do first of all, because it means the analysis that's going to follow is clearer. Okay, so I would always clearly identify the literal root of the metaphor as well as the vehicle of the metaphor, the thing that it's being compared to, before you start explaining the effect. Otherwise you might get tangled, you might not be specific enough, or you might mix the metaphor up. Okay. So here's another worked example for us to go through together. Hope was a fragile seed planted deep inside. How does the writer use imagery to convey her state of mind? And there's the metaphor identified. Hope was a fragile seed. That's the metaphor. Her hope is being compared to a fragile seed. And here we have our Venn diagram again. Left-hand circle, the literal root, her hope. The right-hand side, the figurative image, a fragile seed. And what we need to understand is what goes in the middle, what goes in our area of overlap. In what way is her hope like a fragile seed? And here are some examples of the kind of things you could say when analysing this metaphor. You talk about the fact that it's small currently, but it may grow into something greater. But it needs time to develop. It needs to be nurtured, and it might not amount to anything. Okay, because these are all things that are true both of her hope and a fragile seed. Okay, seeds we hope will grow into something big, but if they don't get watered enough, if the soil is not good enough, if they don't get enough sunlight, if they're disturbed, then they won't actually get to grow into something bigger. So there is potential in her hope that it may grow into something bigger, but it's going to take time. Right now it's very small, it needs to be nurtured, and if it isn't nurtured, then nothing may come of it. And here's that written up as a full answer then. The writer compares her hope to a fragile seed. This suggests that her hope, though small right now, could grow into something greater if properly nurtured. For now, it remains fragile, however, and requires care to ensure it develops and thrives. And this is a good example of the kind of response that might get you 2 marks in an RUAE paper, in terms of looking for something that is both detailed and insightful, because we're talking about multiple aspects of this metaphor. We're talking about the size, we're talking about the potential, we're talking about the need for it to be nurtured and that it might grow to nothing. We're looking at a lot of different aspects of that metaphor, so this is the kind of response that might get you 2 marks. Now, if everything I've said up until now makes sense to you and you are comfortable analysing your imagery that way, you might want to skip this next little section of the video. But I am going to explain an optional formula for structuring imagery responses that, if you're finding it tricky, can actually help you make sure that you're doing all the right things. So again, to be clear, if you're good at analysing metaphors and you understand how to do it, you do not need to follow this structure. And if you find it restrictive and it's limiting what you're writing, then you absolutely should not follow it and just go with your instinct if that's going to get you more marks. But if you're somebody who finds imagery a little bit tricky and you're looking for a structure, for a framework to follow to help you get better at analysing it, then this is one way that you can do that. And of course, when you think about how I'm explaining this, I'm saying it's a formula, I'm saying it's a structure, it's a framework, it's a scaffold. Of course, these are all images as well. One of the things you might learn the more you analyse imagery is that our language is peppered with metaphors. I even just used another metaphor there in terms of pepper, the idea of sprinkling seasoning all across something. So we use metaphors and similes and imagery all the time. We sometimes don't even realize that we're doing it. Okay, so if you're someone who's confident, as I say, with imagery, you don't need to follow the structure. But if you're looking for a little bit of help, a little bit of safety, I'll give you another metaphor, like the stabilizers you might put on a bike if you're learning how to cycle. If you feel like you need that just now, the just as so formula will give you that support, will act as stabilizers for you. But when you're confident, you can take those stabilizers off and cycle on your own. Okay, so here's a general statement of what our formula is. The writer compares x to y, just as y, so x. I imagine some of you are freaking out right now and thinking, why is Mr. Leask giving us some algebra? This feels an awful lot like maths rather than English. I'm so confused, I don't understand what's happening. Don't worry, right? That's me just explaining it as a basic formula. I will take you through the process to show you what I mean by all of this. So to model the just as so formula, we're going to work through another worked example. So if you look at this metaphor here, if you can't empathize with their struggle, then you must have a heart of stone. Not a particularly complicated metaphor, hopefully one you've probably even heard before, so it should be reasonably straightforward for us to analyze. So here's our metaphor deconstructed. The literal root is somebody's heart, their emotions, and what's it being compared to? What's the vehicle of the metaphor? It's a stone. And in what way is the person's heart like a stone? It's cold, hard, uncaring, unyielding, inhuman, those kind of things. So just like before, the first thing we do is we deconstruct the image. The writer compares someone's heart to a stone. We very clearly identified the heart as a literal root and the stone is the figurative image. And I've used colours here so that the yellow is the X that relates to the literal root and the Y that's red that relates to the figurative image, the stone in this example. So the formula we're looking at is the writer compares X to Y, just as Y, so X. So the writer compares someone's heart to a stone, just as a stone is cold, hard, and unfeeling, so anyone who doesn't care about other people's hardships is emotionally cold, uncaring, and harsh. So that's how you use the just as so formula. Just as the thing that it's being compared to is like this, so the literal root is similar to that thing in this particular way. Okay, again, if this is confusing you, you're not sure about it, you don't have to answer in this way. The SQA certainly do not insist on you writing your answers this way. But if you struggle with imagery to write relevant stuff, then trying to think about it in these terms, trying to follow this formula might actually help you. So that's me talk through how you might want to analyze imagery. The most important thing is to remember you always deconstruct the image and then explain the effects of that comparison. And conceptually, you should always be thinking about those Venn diagrams, those two overlapping circles. In the one circle, you've got your literal root. In the other circle, you've got the figurative thing that's being compared to, the vehicle of the metaphor. And the area of overlap is the way in which the two things are similar. And even if you don't physically write those Venn diagrams down in your answers, even if you just do it in your mind, that process of thinking about what is literally being described, what is it being compared to, what are the areas of overlap, that is in essence how you analyze imagery. And as long as you do that, you'll be doing well. And if you want to, if you're struggling to write that down, then the just as so structure is quite a useful way of you making sure that you've covered both sides of that. So now we're going to think about some next steps and then the way that you can practice these skills moving forward on your own. So for starters, I've got some more examples of imagery here that you could have a go at analysing yourself. You could just pause it and have a go at these, or take a screenshot or whatever if you want to have a go at analysing these. Some of these are quite famous, some of these are kind of cliches, things like Heart of Lead, Trophy Wife. Some of these come from literature, like A Sea of Troubles, which comes from Hamlet. Some of them are very similar to what we've spoken about before, a disaster area, very similar to a bomb site, and so on. In the right-hand side, you've got some more complex examples there. Now, some of these are just more abstract and more challenging metaphors. Some of these phrases perhaps include two different metaphors at once, and you maybe have to think about more than one metaphor for you to analyze. Okay, if you find the right-hand column a little bit challenging, don't worry. Those are probably more complex than the kind of things you're likely to get in an RUAE. The ones on the left are the ones that you absolutely must practice. The ones on the right-hand side, they're just some extra ones if you're looking for a bit of extra challenge. Of course, the other way that you can practice your imagery analysis is by revisiting your scrapbook, where you find your own articles and you analyze and annotate those yourself. So you can revisit articles that you've already found or find some fresh articles and identify examples of imagery. Look for metaphors and similes inside there. Deconstruct those images and then annotate the effects. Be clear what's the literal root, what's it being compared to, and in what way are those two things similar. If you want a bit more formal practice, you could write up imagery style questions and then write up a mark scheme, and then cover as many examples as possible in the selected paragraph, and then maybe share with some of your peers in your class or some other friends you have that are doing higher English and answer one another's questions that you've set, and then swap back and have a go at marking them. And the final thing is, just generally speaking, be alert to imagery. As I demonstrated earlier on by accident, we use imagery all the time in English, so be alert to it and always be thinking about what those metaphors and similes convey about the thing that's being described. So anytime you're reading, be on the lookout for it, and in particular think about the attitude that it reveals. And I think also wider in the real world, have a think about journalists and politicians and whenever they use imagery and the reasons that they're making those comparisons as well. So that was my short video on looking at imagery questions in RUAE for SQA Higher English. If you have any questions, do let me know. There are already videos up there looking at word choice and own words questions. And on top of that, there's going to be some more coming later on looking at sentence structure and some of the other question types.